So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, those of you in the room and those of you on Zoom with us. Tonight is the start of Brisley's celebration of the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth. Each talk in this series is designed to provide a background of the world of Jane Austen. And our very first lecture will be given by Dr. Rachel Bynoth, Senior Lecturer and Coordinator in Historical and Critical Studies at Bath Spa University. Rachel is a historian and academic specializing in 18th and 19th century society, particularly emotions, gender, family relations, and politics. Her latest publication is a book chapter included in Bath and Beyond, the Social and Cultural World of the Georgian Assembly Room. Rachel's chapter is entitled Not Just Suitors, Balls and Proposals, the Late 18th Century Bath Marriage Market Assessed. And tonight, Rachel will be talking of the difficulties young women faced in the space governed by a rigid set of social rules. Rules that had to be followed if the young woman's reputation was not to be damaged. Jane Austen, of course, would have been very familiar with the Bath Assembly Rooms, and now we're going to hear about the rooms as well as the trials and tribulations. So can we welcome Rachel Bynoth?
For a young woman like her, 18th century Bath is all balls, promenading, and socializing. The goal, to find a husband. Catherine's situation highlights some of the uncomfortableness, though, of this process, and a few of the dangers, but ends up in a typical Austen happy ending in the form of Catherine's marriage to the wonderful Henry Tilney. Though historians such as Peter Borsay, John Englin, Paul Langford, and Catherine Glover have uncovered what happened in Bath during the season, its delights, its status, and its facades, there is ample room for further discussion on how contemporaries experienced one aspect of Bath, the infamous marriage market. Many discussions rely heavily on Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey as a central source of information to uncover the marriage mart. And given that Austen herself was allegedly not very fond of Bath, and that Austen's source can only actually provide one perspective, and a fictional one at that, I argue that more contemporary experiences are required to construct a more nuanced and detailed picture of some of those experiences that young women in particular had on the marriage market in Bath at the end of the 18th century. And indeed, we're going to be focusing on two of those accounts today. The decision of who to marry, if one was to marry at all, was central to a woman's future in this period. Writers like Eliza Haywood stressed that marriage was, quote, the business on which all our future happiness depends, as it irrevocably affected financial security, familial and societal roles, and indeed one's ultimate happiness. Conduct literature of the period, you can see some of the examples on the screen here, gave various pieces of advice for women seeking a husband, and they all had some things in common. They agreed that a companion at marriage was the ideal to strive for, but they all gave slightly different and sometimes conflicting advice on things like behaviours, manners, and indeed expectations for courtship and marriage. Probably sounds a bit like today, really, doesn't it? There were also other factors, such as any familial, societal, or dynastic expectations. So we're also looking at how families themselves are a central part of this process. And indeed, this stressed the importance of performing well within the Bath scene. Indeed, Bath was almost like a shop window, with each woman provided a space to demonstrate her worth, as a marriage prospect, but also as a woman in society. What she aimed for was to catch a matrimonially minded man's attention. She didn't want a rake, she wanted a matrimonially minded man. Many respectable young women might also find that this was their first proper debut into society. Often young women actually came and did their debut in Bath before going to the bigger rooms in London, for example. Bath was therefore seen as an excellent space for a young woman to come out into society for the first time. But it's therefore unsurprising that as a woman coming to the Bath marriage mart, likely for the first time, there could be anxiety, pressure, and indeed pressure to succeed in more ways than one. Women were trying to reach impossible standards. I think you can see some of those on the screen here. Advice was both concurrent but sometimes conflicting. Women were to please men through conversation, but not talk too much. They had to be fashionable, but they couldn't be vain. They could be graceless, but also artless, but also graceful. Yes, all different quotes from different conduct books, as we see here. Above all, though, women were to remain virtuous, guarding their reputations in order to remain part of polite society, be able to paint, be able to dance. It's little wonder that women entering the public arena felt a little bit of trepidation about whether they would actually succeed in fulfilling not just these expectations, but also people's differing ideas. This anxiety around identity, appearance, and behaviour is not new to 21st century women, and indeed men either. My wider work shows how identity, belonging, and relationships are the pillars of anxiety in the modern world as well as in the 18th century, fueled in particular through, in the modern world, technology. So it's also worth thinking about while I go through my talk, and it'll be something that we'll reflect upon more at the end, about how the situations that I'm discussing can actually illuminate understandings of finding a partner in the 21st century, and indeed the anxieties, expectations, and disappointments that we all face in the pursuit of love. So this talk will offer a bit of a snapshot through two personal narratives, and particularly focusing on two young women. So we've got Bess Canning, although in the talk is a little bit older than her portrait. She will be 16 and 22 in the years that I'll look at. And we've got Elizabeth Betsy Sheridan on the right-hand side. This is the only image we actually have of Bess Canning at 6, so everyone gets to see her as a young girl instead. So, if you visit the pump rooms in Bath today, as I did when I took this picture, you can see a statue of a man standing in a central alcove in the wall. That man was known as Bynoth, who was also known as the King of Bath. Bath was already a prolific spa town, known for its royal patronages, when Nash arrived there just after the turn of the 18th century. So we're looking at around 1701, 1702 at this point. It was his influence when forming and overseeing the social routines and the rules of Bath that actually led to Bath's reputation as a fashionable centre for pleasure, sociability, and spouse hunting. Most work on Bynoth focuses on Nash's influence on Bath as a centre for pleasure and in creating and managing what was known as the company. Fashionable individuals who adhered to Nash's social routines. This is a map slightly later in the period, 1830. And what we wanted to just show you is just roughly what Bath was going to look like at the period where Bess Canning and Betsy Sheridan were entering the marriage scene. So this is where you can start to see, in the bottom down here, you can start to see Pulteney Bridge, you can start to see Great Pulteney Street, which emerged particularly at the end of the 1790s. These routines were so set that, along with Nash's rules and later with his successors' variations, these were printed in the Bath Guide every single year. And the routines went something like this. You might spend the morning in the pump rooms, often to view the subscription book to note who was actually in town and who had left. This was a daily routine, so you tended to get a very up-to-date list of who exactly was in Bath at that time. Afterwards came what John Elgin calls a lengthy walking route, which provided exercise, but also, more importantly, ample opportunities to be seen and to see other members of the company. This might involve maybe a trip to Parade Gardens, later Great Portney Street, or shopping perhaps in Milsom Street. The afternoon might be spent calling on people, taking tea, or hosting visitors yourself, before a ball or the theatre would round out the day in the evening. Later in the century, around 1800, small private social gatherings became more popular than going to all the large assemblies, or you might go to a mixture, depends. However, Beau Nash was also instrumental in creating Bath's reputation as a marriage market, and this is what we're here to talk about today. For it was this structured routine of sociability and amusements that allowed people to see and be seen by other members of the company, which in turn made Bath an excellent place to go spouse hunting. Bath's reputation as a marriage mart continued to flourish long after his death into the later 18th century through the rise of print media, and we can see some of those examples on the screen here. The Bath Chronicle in particular listed all the recent arrivals into Bath, alongside the latest births, deaths and marriages, and also the news of the subscription balls at the assembly rooms, as well as things like theatre gossip. The Times and the Bath Chronicle, among others, aided the reputation of Bath as the place to visit, for, quote, company continued flowing in here from all quarters. Beyond this, the newspapers also kept up with the latest gossip for things like engagements, marriages, divorces and scandals, noting in 1787 that in Bath there was 1 elopement, 3 flipped ankles and 2 pregnancies. But also that the young ladies were also becoming wiser to the charms of the fortune hunter, for, quote, not one lucky bit in this way has yet taken place. All eyes and reports were on the comings and goings of the marriage mart in the print press. And part of this gossip included reports of groups or societies, such as the fortune hunters. And one report from August 1800 mentioned that they sought heiresses for wives at Bath, for they were, quote, firmly held and bound to pay so many thousands if he gets the heiress by the funds of the club, treating the search for the wife as a game to be played at his all-men's club. Thus, print media was a key tool for continuing sociability, but also the prospect to be seen and be seen, but also to avoid potential pitfalls. However, Bath's clientele had changed by this later 18th century period, for as the century wore on, it shifted from the aristocratic and upper-class circles to a more broader social mixture, with more middling gentry and professional middle classes joining the social rounds by the end of the century. And the 2 young ladies that I'm going to be talking about are part of these social circles, respectable but not aristocratic. They're both associated with those sort of acquaintances from the upper echelons of society, largely due to their family's Whig politics. Nevertheless, Bath's reputation as a marriage market remained. Indeed, so prolific was Bath's reputation as a marriage market throughout the 18th century that historian John Eglin suggests that Bath was to matrimony what Newmarket was to horses and Billingsgate was to fish. However, it doesn't mean it was an easy place to navigate, because it wasn't an easy task. So as I mentioned at the top of this lecture, Catherine Morland represented the teenage debutante entering society for the first time, and her education of society, behaviour and manners within a glittering social scene at the end of the 18th century. Yet while a teenage Jane Austen was experiencing her own ventures into public life, around the same time, 16-year-old Bess Canning wrote of her very first social season in Bath. And this section of the talk will be considering the anxieties, not only trying to obtain a husband, but the difficulties of actually just finding a dance partner, especially during a period of war. So just to say, Bess Canning was the only child of Stratford and Mehitable Hitty Canning, and will be referred to as Hitty throughout the talk, a respectable middle-class Anglo-Irish family who rubbed shoulders with the elite in Whig political society, such as the Duchess of Devonshire, Charles James Fox, Elizabeth Sheridan, and the Duchess of Duncannon. However, these connections had lapsed after the recent death of Elizabeth Sheridan a few months before Bess's debut in 1792. Thus, whilst known in elite circles, Bess actually had very little dowry and was now in Bath to begin her venture into the marriage market, and effectively was a pretty face with no money. Her mother, Hitty Canning, did not chaperone her daughter on either of her trips to Bath, but this doesn't indicate a lack of interest in her marriage prospects. Like Mrs. Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Hitty's business in life was to see Bess married and starting her own family and household, a position that Hitty had been training Bess for since she was a very young adolescent, and indeed I've written about that very training elsewhere. A daughter's success in society reflected on her mother, who handled her education and her upbringing. So Hitty's own concern and devotion to her children was also key to her societal reputation as a mother. Letters, therefore, allowed Hitty to remain an anxious mother at a distance. Whilst continuing to rear her younger children at home, she was able to keep an eye on Bess while she was going around the marriage mart. She had a lot emotionally invested in this, and you can see that from the letters. Her accounts dictate a need for every little detail, and she watched her daughter's every move through the correspondence. Bess visited Bath twice, so once as mentioned above when she was 16 in 1792 to 93, and then she visited again in 1798 when she was 22. Throughout the correspondence with her mother, Bess's marriage prospects occupied a great deal of space and indicated that the aim for both trips was for Bess to find a suitable husband. Indeed, just before she went in 1798, her aunt and her two uncles went as far as to write poetry about her, saying about her suitability to become a wife to a very lucky man, which she proudly discussed in her letters to her mother. These poems focused on her accomplishments, her beauty, and her companionship, all key traits that she needed to be successful on the marriage mart. However, Bess didn't actually get married on either of these trips, and actually didn't get married until 1805, when she was actually 29. And it reflects another of Austen's heroines, Anne Elliot, who married late in life to a gentleman who was an earlier flame, just like Bess did. So it's ironic that she starts off as Catherine Morland, 16, excited, and ends up almost spinster-like getting married at a later age like Anne Elliot, very much bookending the two novels around Bath. That's what happens when you put all of the things in. There we go. Remaining at the family home in Wanstead in London, Hitty's letters depict her micromanagement of her daughter. Older or married women, often relatives, would act as chaperones for visits such as this one to Bath, and played a key role in safeguarding the young woman's reputation, as well as helping her make social connections and, where necessary, maintain instruction in societal behaviour. On both her visits to Bath, Bess actually was accompanied by her aunt, Elizabeth Lee, and her cousins Letitia Percival and Bess Lee. And fun fact, Letitia Percival gets married and actually is mentioned in Jane Austen's letters because she actually left her husband. So it's a very unfortunate letter that you get from Mrs. Lee when she finds out that she's eloped away. As Hitty wasn't going to be physically monitoring her daughter herself, she demanded in her, quote, 2 or 3 last letters that Bess tell her about her societal behaviours, quote, whether I be a silent or a talkative miss when I am dancing, or on what topics I touch. Whilst the language here reflects Bess's interpretation, Hitty's behaviour suggests that she was quite anxious for good news regarding Bess's social performance in Bath, a point she explicitly refers to in her earlier letters to her daughter in 1789, when she was 13 and learning to enter society. Indeed, she says things like, "Pray, have you combed the powder out of your hair?" This was one of the things that actually took place in 1792 because of the powder tax. So there was a powder tax in aid of getting money towards the war, and of course it became unfashionable then to powder your hair. And so we have a lovely letter saying, "Have you combed the powder out of your hair? It's no longer fashionable." And a wonderful letter back from Bess going, "Have you seen my beautiful red locks? Because I don't have any powder in my hair." And we get lovely warnings, such as this one from 1789, where Hitty is telling her daughter that we must act with great circumspection, for many eyes are upon us, and all our actions will be well scrutinised. Very much something that will be useful for Bess when 3 years later she was entering Bath. Hitty's uneasiness regarding Bess's experiences continued into her second trip in 1798, when Bess was 22, and it was evident enough for Bess to reassure her mother in her very first letter home. This was towards the end of the Revolutionary Wars, which Great Britain had entered in 1793. She speaks of, quote, transcendent good fortune. Surely nothing was ever half so lucky or half so well timed, and that she was in a, quote, whirlwind of felicity. However, in the same sentence, she quickly turns to her mother's feelings, pleading that, quote, pray feel no anxieties about me. Mrs. Lee considers of everything for me and takes as much care and looks after me just as if I were her own. I make no doubt all will go on exactly as you could wish. Tell my dear little P, her aunt, I shall be quite angry with her if she anticipates anything but good. Do not suffer the least apprehensions about my dress and so forth. You know Mrs. Lee's attention, and Joanna does everything for me, her maid. If possible, I shall try to get a few lessons in dancing. I must make hay while the sun shines if possible, and I will have you know I never looked half so well. So whether Bess was really prompted by the likelihood of Hitty's advice potentially cutting through her joy, or genuine anticipation of Hitty's worries, is difficult to ascertain. But what Bess is doing is communicating that she initially saw this as a very positive experience, and does so on both occasions, and she's really ready and prepared to undertake, even without her mother by her side, her experience in Bath. Excitement, hope and joy fill Bess's first pages, communicating that whilst Hitty was anxious about her daughter's prospects, at the beginning Bess herself was not. The beginning of the marriage market was less a time of anxiety for debutantes, but excitement. It was more the discomfort of mothers and chaperones as they navigated the initial events, the shopping, the choices of the current season to try and secure a coveted match. However, Bess's tone would soon change from excitement to anxiety. I appreciate you not suggesting you're actually going to be able to read this. I'll read it out in just a moment. So that initial excitement of entering the Bath marriage market can be seen in 16-year-old Bess's opening letter from 1792, detailing her very first ball. It reads much more like the excitement shown by Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, and her rushed tone denotes her excitement. I was dressed, for I suppose you like to hear everything, in my petticoat, with everything proper underneath, with a jacket made of the pink poplin and a white sash, and half sleeves of lawn and a muslin handkerchief put on very nicely. Parsley dressed my hair very well, and on it I wore a wreath of red roses. Now don't you think I was mighty smart? Well then, to the rooms we went about 7:30, and got very good places, the best part of the room, and all that you know. So then the dancing began, and I wondered what my fate would be, for though I suspected the kind Mrs. Lee had been her interest for me the day before, yet I could not be certain. Well, the first dance was finished when I heard Mr. Lee say, I wish your partner was come. Ho, ho, I thinks I, smoke something low. In after moments came Mr. Terringham, and he came up to us. He says to me, shall you like to dance? I got up and danced like a pea upon a trencher. My partner, I assure you, was something very smart, not to say handsome, and danced very well and was very good-natured when this dance was over. Then the cotillions began. Mr. Terringham took another partner. When one cotillion was danced, we went to tea. And after tea, there was another which took up so long a time that we were in a fright, lest my partner should forget me in the interim, and leave me in the lurch. So the old aunt so settled with a Mr. Blaney Rothra that if my partner did not come back to me, that he should dance with me. So I had 2 strings to my bow, which, however, we found unnecessary, for as soon as the cotillion was over, Mr. Terringham came to me and took me out, and I danced again. Bess was afraid to look at me the first time, but now she and Aunt Fan so perched themselves on a bench that to my great annoyance, they saw everything I did. However, I had the satisfaction to hear from them, since that I performed very well, When I began the first dance, I was in a terrible fright, but afterwards I felt quite at my ease. The last dance was very pleasant. Now, this lengthy letter almost reads quite breathless. You may notice there's not a lot of punctuation here. Yes, I'm going to be a bit out of breath, perhaps, for the next few moments. Bess's letters from her visit to Bath in 1792 in particular often read like this to start off with, as she continually apologises for hurrying to finish writing before attending the next ball or theatre production. Her letters show the importance of chaperones in securing dance partners for young ladies, as the Lees playing a pivotal role in Bess's success in securing not one, but 2 partners for her very first ball. Bess's detailed description appears to have satisfied Hitty. Indeed, the detail here suggests that Bess paid great attention to her surroundings and the experience, a reflection of the observant nature of others in a Georgian ballroom. Bess herself notes that her aunt and cousin saw everything she did and owned her own fright at being observed, but the success of the evening meant Hitty received a really excited letter detailing Bess's triumph. However, Bess was less successful in finding a partner for the next ball, despite efforts from the Lees and indeed her cousin George Canning, who at that point was about to enter Parliament, so it was just a few years before he entered Parliament. They all came to assist her, and unfortunately they were less successful. The opening to her letter immediately notes the lack of suitors, as a Mr. Badcock was obliged to stand up with 7 or 8 ladies successively for the opening minuets. Bess's letter suggests that not just any partner would do, though, as she turned down a boy of 15, for the torrid of the old aunts were aghast at the idea of my making my first essay with a dump of a boy. So Mrs. Lee, in her cunning little manner, made a pretty little speech to the gentleman, such as, Miss Canning was not sure that she could dance at all, but if she did, Mr. Lee had engaged a partner for her. Sadly, no further suitors could be found, and Bess noted to her mother that the next time I go to a ball, I now know the manoeuvres of it, so I shall get them to look out for a partner earlier in the evening, and then I shall have a better chance. So she's still not too worried at the moment. You know, first disappointment, she's fine. But part of Bess's struggles also came from the context in which she was going to the ball at Bath. It appears that there was an art to securing a dance partner amongst a scarcity of men. For in late 1792, drafting had begun for the Revolutionary Wars, and so the lack of beaux in the room is likely a reflection of the beginning of this war effort. Those that were considered marriageable were often overseas, continuing the fight, and so this made finding a marriage partner, an already anxiety-inducing task, even harder. Jane Austen herself subtly notes this in Pride and Prejudice, when heroine Elizabeth Bennet sits down at the Meryton Ball for want of a partner. So despite the very positive start we've seen from the letters, from the 30th of December, when she was unable to secure a partner, she began to be in a very, very bad way at the ball on the 2nd of January 1793, despite the fact her cousin George Canning trying to secure a partner amongst the dearth of gentlemen present. However, through their connections, Mr. Foster, husband to Miss Rebecca Machews, who is a good-natured, genteel sort of man, said he was acquainted with several gentlemen, who at that moment, seeing one of them, brought him by the nape of the neck to me and introduced him to me by the name of Tippin, Tippin, Mr. Tippin. How should you like your daughter Tippin? I assure you he's a very smart little man, and as they like me descend from the ancient family of Tippin, very great people in the kingdom of Ireland, but let it be great or little, I never saw a pea upon a trencher dance better than my little partner. We danced 3 dances together, very briskly. Really, I have never seen such a civil, good-natured creature. Mr. Lee asked him if he liked music, to which reason they gave him an invitation to the party on Tuesday. So, now looking up again. Bess's letters recount her feelings of disappointment and fear, because she really opened the letter by saying she was very much afeard that I should not ever get a partner. But her tone changes immediately once she secures a beau for the evening. Her letters become excited and fast-paced once more to inform her mother once again of her success. Her letters were acting as a vessel to communicate not just her achievements, but also her emotions. Just want to show you some of the pictures here. So this is of the main ballroom in the assembly rooms. And this is where we're going to start thinking about the pressures of the dance. For after one managed to find a dance partner, there was the dance itself. Dancing was part of the wider social culture of Bath, where, quote, appearances meant everything. Individuals were constantly on show, where the social spaces such as the pump rooms, theatre, and promenades, all designed for displaying oneself and to scrutinise others. As Francis Lambert notes in the treatise on dancing, the object of learning to dance is not to acquire the most difficult movements of the feet. The object to be attained is an easy carriage of the body and a graceful management of the arms and head. A person that dances well in this respect will be graceful in a room and will be distinguished upon all occasions. So it's unsurprising then that the Bath Chronicle still advertised space to practice dancing at the assembly rooms as late as 1800. For dancing was not just a series of steps, but an important ritual in displaying one's grace and deportment. Indeed, dancing was so important that children were schooled in it from a very young age. Bess's letters note that she was enrolled in dance letters throughout her adolescence, and she attended a ball at Mrs. Curtis's prior to her debut in Bath society. In her memoirs from her childhood in the 1790s, Susan Sibbald noted that, quote, Wednesday was dancing day at my school. Mademoiselle Le Mercier taught the, quote, positions and steps, with Miss Fleming, the main dance mistress, teaching the minuets and figure dancing, implying that more than just the steps were taught during these dances to the young ladies. They needed 3 different instructors. I mean, my goodness. Sibbald's school held a dance at the upper assembly rooms every 3 years in front of the grown-ups. And led by the master of ceremonies, they showed off the Levites, as the school pupils were known. Thus, the pressure to perform and to, quote, do credit to Bath, which was Mademoiselle Le Mercier's quote, which she constantly is talking about, is very evident, particularly when Susan was presented with a very different head wreath and was fearing that everyone would be looking at my conspicuous head. However, when the dancing was a success, there was rewards, as Susan's sister, quote, danced so much and was noticed by the Duchess of York, who spoke to her and kissed her. And this is some examples from the 18th century of people being taught to dance, particularly private practices that often took place by instructors before balls. And this is a wonderful image of the minuet. You can see this at the assembly rooms. And we've got a lovely one of the minuet quadrille in the middle there, so you can have a little bit of a closer look. And whilst there were several dance styles, it was the minuet which particularly showed off a dancer's poise and control due to its slow pace. The minuet was a French dance, danced traditionally by a single pair, but was danced by many pairs in a row by the end of the 18th century, as you can see in the screen above. Usually, these were the first dances to open the ball. Minuets were usually performed from the court of St James's Palace to the homes of nobility and gentry in London and the assembly rooms of Great Britain. The minuets were danced by young ladies in particular searching for a husband, and as such, it was a dance that was studied by every eye in the room. Lord Chesterfield once commented upon the minuets danced at Bath, stating that, you would laugh if you were to see the dancing in the ballrooms, where of 20 minuets there was at least 19 ridiculous ones, performed by people who had either very bad dancing masters or who so invincibly awkward as to baffle the care and the pains of the best. Oh dear. Bess's cousin, quote, Letitia danced a minuet but did not perform quite as well as was expected because she was a good deal frightened. Whereas Bess just got off dancing with the cotillion, not choosing to exhibit before so many people who were watching the steps of every miss with criticising eyes. This is despite a previous letter of Bess's to her mother before she went to Bath, a mere few weeks before this, where she said that she'd been taking dance lessons and that she could now dance a minuet with Pa Grave, pretty bobbish, which is good. So she chickened out, basically. The pressures of the Bath ballroom and Letitia's less favourable experience had clearly influenced Bess's decision not to dance the minuet in Bath. After all, appearances meant everything in a city like Bath, and Bess's decision suggests that she felt it was better not to try than fail to impress. The letters also continue to evidence the impact that the war had on those marriage prospects of the young woman left behind. As the letters move into Bess's second visit to Bath in 1798, it becomes apparent that Bess was not making much progress at all in her search for a husband. Hitty makes comments in her letters to Bess which suggests that the war has really affected the marriage market by this point. For she says that the girls ought to all pray for a peace, for till that much-desired blessing arrives, it is in vain for them to crop and dress and go to public places. Poor little peas chops feel considerably yesterday on hearing of the terrible scarcity of beaux at Bath. Hitty's letter suggests that attempting to find a husband in Bath during these wars was in vain, and suggests that Bess was unlikely to find a husband through the more usual route of attending the balls and performances. Indeed, sadly, Bess confirms Hitty's suspicions, reporting that all gatherings were, quote, defective in the same respect. All women and no men. For Bess's part, she displays more boredom than anxiety in the 1798 letters after her initial optimism, because she was, quote, forced to flirt a little with Lady Mary Ann's son for want of something better to do. The anxiety of the marriage market then appears to have primarily lay with the parents in its early stages rather than the daughters, who quickly caught up once reality hit. However, as the letters continued, we really do see that sense of uneasiness creep into Bess's vivid descriptions of the lack of men in Bath. She writes that, quote, a kind of fatality seems to have attended all my beaux, not that I wish to be melancholic just now, and by the way, there's only 3 of them. Whilst concerns of finding a suitable husband are evident across many eras of history, this particular example typifies the anxieties of trying to secure a match during a time of war. The correspondence reveals both the difficulties of the marriage market, but also the behaviours of chaperones and parents in trying to secure their daughter's match being essential. Sadly, we find that Hitty is not pleased with Bess's reports and says, you need to come home now, it's not working. And on that note, we're going to move to our second Bess, Elizabeth Betsy Sheridan. For while Bess was a young woman during her forays into Bath's social scene, Betsy Sheridan was 27 when she entered the Bath marriage market in 1785, the same age as Anne in Persuasion, and would have been considered old at this point to be looking for her first husband. Her letters immediately speak of her tiredness. She'd just come from a full season in London, and indeed it was London, Bath, London, Bath, London, Bath, London, to her sisters, then Bath. However, their relocation to this particular time to Bath was as much for her father's ill health as well as to find a future husband for Betsy. Thus, historians do need to be mindful of the context of young women entering the marriage market. Not all of them are optimistic first-timers, in awe of the new sights and smells which were on offer, but for many it was simply another round of socialising, balls and disappointment. Betsy's letters express her really low spirits and disengagement with the events going on around her. Interestingly, she writes to her married sister, Alicia Le Fano, that she is, quote, to look out for a young bachelor here, and Harry says nothing about coming home. I see how it is. I am thrown off, and you are keeping him for someone else. But to be even with you, I am determined not to accept any one of the numerous offers which I shall certainly meet with here. Can anyone tell who she's in love with? Betsy's letter suggests that she too sees Bath as a space where attachments are formed and proposals are made. Yet her letter expresses a sense that she's actually interested in marrying Alicia's brother-in-law, Harry. Interestingly enough, she actually marries him 6 years later. Potentially, she might already be in love with him at this point, or she could be using this as an excuse. Given that they got married 6 years later, I imagine she probably was already in love with him. Either way, Betsy clearly expresses that she does not wish to engage with the marriage market in Bath, despite her father's opinion. She often expresses this through a sense of repetition and boredom. She says that she's living the same old life, airing, home and cards, not very enchanting. But to say the truth, I'm not in spirits to enjoy any other. On another occasion, she meets a Miss Brooke, whose company she enjoys more than all the amusements of Bath put together. With such a prescribed routine, John Elgin notes that boredom was actually registered by several guests visiting Bath. They could, like Betsy, have come straight from the London season, with its own routine of Bath balls, concerts and spouse hunting, which would have exasperated the repetitive nature of Bath's social scene. But however, expressing boredom could also be an example of what Elena Carrera calls the social act of communication. That is, the desire to express boredom could communicate other feelings or thoughts. Betsy might be hiding a sense of shame as her lack of ability to find a husband, or perhaps a secret love of the humdrum routine that she actually denounces. Indeed, at this point, 18th century fashion for boredom, often equated to what the French call ennui, was actually very, very fashionable. Both terms denote several different emotional states such as annoyance, worry, frustration, and even impotence. But Betsy's boredom is very much likely, therefore, more complex than just enacting a daily repetitive routine. It's most likely her speaking in the social language of fashion. You can have a look at the typical daily routine here as well. You can see the Octagon Chapel was one of her first ports of call. Then you go to the pump rooms in the morning, taking the waters. She then promenaded along Bath's many streets, so she often went to Great Portney Street, around the Royal Crescent, sometimes the Circus. She'd then go shopping and visiting, and then would take in a theatre or a ball. So not very dissimilar to the routines that Bess discusses in her letters. The letter could also be an important space to articulate feelings which could not be displayed publicly or even to other family members. Betsy's father, quote, had insisted on subscribing me to the cotillion balls, which are on Thursdays, so I'm fairly in for a round of hurry. This visit records the usual attendance of balls and that Betsy sauntered about the pump room, libraries, etc. In short, spent a true Bath morning. I should not choose to spend many such. This likely resulted in what was known as fatigue fever, likely head stroke. But the name fatigue suggests another hidden meaning beyond the medical to denote that tiredness and ennui, which was that regular social pattern of Bath. So it could even be a malady that is now becoming fashionable here. Betsy noted that she didn't feel like she belonged in Bath and its social world, suggesting that potential worry, frustration, and even loneliness was part of her expressions of boredom. She wrote that in the gardens when she was walking with her father, a friend came to stop and talk to him. However, quote, as I was unemployed, I felt rather awkward. Came and stood by a set of people who honoured me with no other notice than an impertinent stare. Bet we've all been in one of those situations before. Her use of the term set of people denotes distance and unfamiliarity. Betsy was informing her sister that she was not part of this group of people. Her use of the term awkward communicates the opposite of that desired poise, grace, and self-control that young ladies were desperately seeking to show off, to show their wifely qualities to potential spouses and their families. Yet it was Betsy that judged the set. Their stare was impolite and uncalled for, and exposes that constant scrutiny that all that socialised in Bath were under. The discussion of not belonging added to a sense of loneliness, and this is an image here by Angelica Kaufmann, which is actually depicting an 18th century idea of loneliness. Despite the fact that Betsy was being surrounded by people in Bath society, she still said that she felt lonely. She, quote, wished for money every day, for certainly it could procure me the highest gratification I can taste in this world, the society of the few that I truly love. Here, loneliness is perceived as the absence of loved ones, whilst Betsy's experiencing of the company of Bath is lacking or deficient in forming those meaningful relationships. And these were things that supplied feelings of belonging, happiness, and meaning, feelings that she actually attributes to her sister. Her mention of money could be for two reasons. Either she can't afford to visit her sister, and indeed she doesn't get to visit her very often in Ireland, or money would allow her the freedom to not need to settle down and find a husband, and therefore she doesn't have to be in Bath. Either way, Bath was not providing the amusements that she was wanting, particularly also those kinds that were seen in Catherine Morland's letters, Bess Canning's letters, and indeed other sources. Importantly, Betsy's letter suggests that to write letters to her sister was not enough. It is physical presence that she craved, likely because she does actually want to leave Bath. She actually says that she's becoming indifferent, but Betsy's ambitions for her time in Bath were clearly different from her father's, as on her next visit in 1786, Betsy letters communicates her promise to dance this evening, as my father says, he doesn't understand my turning old woman, and our young Oxonian Mr. Drake is to have the honour of my hand. I do as I am bid on this occasion, but to say the truth, I am surprised to find how many indifferent I am, grown to those sort of amusements. But in my present situation, I think it's a duty to struggle with that indifference, as it would exclude me from the society I must mix with, and indulging my feelings will not restore me to that I have lost. Once again, Betsy uses her letters to communicate her distance from the company that she then kept in Bath, but also those tensions of her role in society, along with trying to support the wishes of her father, particularly though she was quite annoyed about this because it actually kept her from her beloved sister. She uses aging language, so she calls herself old woman, and this communicates that Betsy's actions are more in line with that we would associate with an elder woman in the period, not a young lady seeking a marriage match. While she reveals that she is indifferent to those sorts of amusements, but it's her duty to struggle with that indifference, she shows that tension between trying to please her father and trying to please herself. Like with Bess Canning's letters, there is a sense that parents were highly influential in the experiences of the Bath marriage mart, highlighting those real tensions that women found they were in during this period. Both the correspondence of Bess Canning and Betsy Sheridan nuance those more typical viewpoints of the excited Bath debutante portrayed in Northanger Abbey. Their letters present anxious chaperones, bored young ladies with many mixed feelings about Bath's social scene, and crucially allude to the difficulties faced by these women entering the marriage market, particularly at a period of war. The letters themselves are part of the shaping of these emotions and experiences, hurried scribbles to record the many details of triumph in the ballroom, or really important spaces to convey notions of affection, boredom, and anguish. The young women in Bath's ballrooms then each had their own contexts which fashioned their Bath experience. So what does this tell us about finding a partner today? Well, it shows that our anxieties around finding the one are not new, and that path to love and marriage is full of pitfalls, whether we have social freedom or really regular routine. It's a journey of anxiety. Whilst the financial straits of singleness have ebbed, to an extent, with women far more able to find options to support a single status, there are still stigmas and challenges to confront as a single woman in society. Using apps does not diminish the anxieties of the conversation, the need or desire to act and behave in certain ways, the intentions of the partner to be discovered, or the desire to show the world your marriageable identity. And we can still reflect on how some of these social challenges of meeting partners in the 21st century still mirror some of those experiences in the Bath ballroom. It actually shows we have a lot more in common in our search for love with these young women navigating those perils of courtship than we might think. And that's a real human need to understand that in the search for love, in all its forms, it's an anxious path. Thank you. Good.
Well, thank you very much. And we now have time for questions, if anybody in the audience would like to ask. Yeah, several here. One for you. There we go, right.
Hi, sorry, could you clarify me if the Betsy Sheridan is in relation to the Elizabeth Linley?
Yes. So it's her sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law, thank you very
much. Sister-in-law, yes.
Good question.
I just mentioned, just while I'm on, you mentioned the Duchess of Duncannon, the sister of the Duchess of Devonshire,
That's right, yes.
with whom Richard Sheridan had an affair.
Indeed, yes. Don't worry, I've got plenty of letters on that one as well.
Just to keep it in the family.
Yeah.
Gossip
They all know
tonight.
each other. Have you noticed this?
Kind of an incidental question, really, but how do the letters of Bess Canning survive, but only one portrait of her as a child?
It's a good question as to why she never actually got another portrait, and it's quite surprising, actually. But the reason the letters have survived is because her and her mother actually kept them all. So they've preserved them all and actually sent them down through family members, particularly from the female line. And half of them have ended up in Leeds, and half of them have ended up in our own Bath record office here. And a lot of it was to do with the value that was placed on these letters, so they were worth preserving at the time. They were seen not just as symbols of communication, but also as symbols of love and affection. And that's one of the reasons they're most likely to have survived. But yeah, they've actually been put into wills and things moving down the family. And that's usually one of the ways that these kinds of letters survive, and particularly these bigger collections.
Somebody else, yeah?
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned that it's called The Season.
Yes.
I'm just curious, so was it a all year round thing? And how long would they typically spend in Bath before they disappeared back off to London?
So it was a season because it was a particular period of time. So usually it was around end of October into November, and then usually finished around April. And that usually was the time that they would then usually go to London for the summer. And then there's usually a period, particularly from the aristocratic circles, where they'd go shooting in the country in the sort of late summer, early autumn. They went to London particularly when the Parliament was sitting in that more sort of summer period. So the period that people might be more familiar with knowing from Bridgerton, for example, was about April to sort of July-ish. But the Bath season was slightly longer, but encompassed the winter. So you were here over sort of December, January into February.
Can I follow up? So the London season was just in the summer?
Mostly, I mean, there was things going on all year round, but the most fashionable element was sort of around April to around sort of the end of August. And then that's when they all went off to their country homes for the shooting. Got a couple of questions in the chat if you'd like me to have a look at those. So we've got a couple of questions saying that I mentioned that one of the women started her daily routine with chapel or going to a place of worship. Was that common, that people would start their day with morning prayer at a church or chapel? They usually did go to church or chapel, but I don't know if it's always the very first thing they did in the morning. I know that they definitely always went on a Sunday at your usual time, but beyond that, we get sort of smatterings of people going to church and going to chapel at different times. So whether it was always the first thing they did in the morning is unclear, but certainly in this case, they definitely went first thing. And the other thing I've got are the letters that I've quoted available to read in a book or online. Partially, some of the letters have been published, but the majority are still just manuscript sources. And those that have been published have only been published in small excerpts, so not any really in full. So no, not. You can read some of them, but the majority are still very much manuscript source.
I was wondering, what caused the importance of the ball to, fall out of favor? In other words, it was important during this time, but when did it sort of stop being so important?
So the ballroom itself, particularly more from a Bath perspective, comes with the sort of the rise of Bath, particularly as a spa town, and then also its decline when we started to move to the seaside when that became more fashionable, particularly places like Brighton, for example. They still held balls and assemblies in these places, but as Bath's sort of social status waned, that's when we started to see the social season itself start to wane as well. Assemblies actually continued right up until the Victorian period, and then they sort of turned into more balls or dances rather than assemblies, so we start to change terminology at that point. But you might see from 19th century sources that balls continue right the way through into the 19th century and even into the early 20th. So it's more about terminology and those spaces. So they become more cotillion balls. They might then be called dancing halls or dancing spaces, and eventually probably end up with what we now call nightclubs.
Do we have another question? Yeah, good, Paul.
Thank you. In the minuets, the women, from what you said, they could get very nervous because of being a focus of attention. Presumably the same thing applied to the men, but maybe that didn't matter. But I mean, Lord Chesterfield seems to suggest a lot of them were duffers. Did people actually judge people? I mean, if you were a good dancer, did that make you more marriageable? Or was it just the worry about showing yourself up in public that was what was causing the nervousness?
A bit of everything, to be fair. The main reason that they were so nervous is that tended to be where you got judged the most. So when you're entering, they tended to say, oh, she's got 2 left feet, or I didn't like where her head was. And Lord Chesterfield's commentary very much shows that he was particularly scrutinising the every inches of everyone dancing the minuet. From the male perspective, the men tended to be the one that led the sort of the charge, as it were, to come forward and actually gain partners. They tended to have a position where they didn't have the same fragility of reputation as the women, and particularly for people like Bess, who don't have a dowry, for example, which a social faux pas might overcome, because we always find someone that's willing to marry someone with money. That's particularly when the nerves set in, because that's a particularly judgmental period of the evening. So yeah, the minuet in particular, I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but you tend to move very, very slowly as well. So it's a lot of control and poise, and that's why it's particularly used to denote the grace of the particular dancer. Just while that's coming around, I'll just do one more quickly that's online. Okay. We had the Bath guide that was shown on the screen, pointing at the do's and don'ts of behaviour that was expected in Bath, and they were saying, was good and bad behaviour policed in any way? Yes, was the answer. You could actually be thrown out if you were breaking particularly dress codes, which were very strict. Yes, all balls had to finish, I believe it was 11 or midnight, I can't remember which, but they actually stopped everything very, very abruptly and ushered everybody out very quickly. Yeah, these were seen as the sort of the epitome of actually keeping social order at the time. These did relax slightly more after Nash died and others took over, but even so, it was still very much the rules that were keeping these places fashionable and well-to-do. So yes, they did police this, but it did get slightly less intense as the century wore on.
What happened, so if you were successful in the marriage market, so you got married, and then there'd be quite a few years before you had a daughter that you were taking to these things. What happened? What did you do in that period while you were a wife of a respectable husband? Did you go to the balls, or were you expected to stay at home? And if you went, what were you expected to do? How were you expected to behave when you were there?
So again, it would entirely depend on who you are, who you were with, because once you've been married, in fact, the minute you've been married, even if you're 16, you can be a chaperone to another relative or to another young lady. And you sometimes get some very strange situations where 17 and 18-year-olds are actually eligible to be chaperones for, say, 20-year-old girls, which is very strange to think about. But the idea is you might well be going back as a chaperone, and in which case you would be seen as a married woman, and you would not be partaking in things like minuets, which tend to be reserved for those of marriageable status. You might be sitting with the what we might call the dowagers area, even if you are a very young woman, because you're actually of a different social status and a different social marker. You're more likely to be the ones writing about how people were acting, how people were talking. You're much more likely to be a commentator in these arenas rather than the dancer, for example. Married women were allowed to dance. They were able to come up. But it definitely was much more likely if you were a young lady looking for a partner that you'd be more likely to get the matches. And you're more likely to give over a partner potentially to a young lady you might be chaperoning. Because as you might have seen from my talk here, they had a lot to do in terms of manoeuvring and getting those partners for the chaperones. So they had quite a busy evening. If not, they could always go and play cards.
Good evening. Hello. I'd like to know the two women that you did in your research, was it difficult to find two women to do the research on, or were you sort of spoilt for choice? Could you have a choice of who to follow through?
So for this research, the women themselves kind of came to me, actually, because I was actually looking at Bess Canning's letters as part of a wider project for my PhD. So I looked at all of the Canning letters, 14 different members of the family, and it became very clear that what was going on in these letters was really interesting, connected to the Bath ballroom. And as I mentioned in my talk, Bess's mum, Hitty, was really good friends with Eliza Sheridan. And as we've seen, that was her sister-in-law. And so I was looking at this journal from Betsy as part of my ongoing research, and actually found out that she'd had some of these interesting ideas around the Bath ballroom and the Bath marriage mark. And so it was more they came to me, and I ended up discovering what was really interesting perspectives and different perspectives. Actually from this, I've ended up finding a few little bits more that are starting to sort of corroborate that actually it was a very diverse space, and actually a lot of different experiences were going on. Lots of roles being played as well.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I think you mentioned there was a happy ending for both Bess and Betsy, that they did actually get married. Can you just tell us a little bit more about who they married, and do we know the circumstances of how they met their husbands?
So Betsy Sheridan had met her future husband, Harry Lefanu, because her sister was married to his brother. So the two sisters married the two brothers, effectively. And she'd gone to Bath in this period, what I believe was already in love with him. She married him 6 years after the letters here. And she talks about him a lot in the letters back to her sister. So I suppose there is a question of whether she really wanted to go back to see her sister, or to see Harry. We're not entirely sure. So she was very much going into this situation to please her father. And actually, we don't know if she was trying to get over Harry, if she thought he was a prospect. But she did go back and see her sister, spent quite a bit of time, came back, spent a bit more time, and they ended up getting engaged. So for what, and we don't know the exact circumstances of that, because she only wrote the journal when she was a single woman. But I wouldn't be surprised if, given what she's been saying, is she kept going to see her sister for a lot more than just to see her sister. Bess actually was a neighbour in Wanstead. So they moved to Wanstead in 1789 when Bess was 13. And it was a George Barnett, who was one of the neighbours, and never really gave him much of a thought at first. Thought he was quite nice, but never really saw him as a serious prospect. Bess herself actually kept not brilliantly. She was quite an ill, or what they might call fragile young lady. So she did get ill quite a lot. And there was a point where you think she might have got married to George a few years before she did, but ill health actually kept them from marrying. And there's some lovely letters from her mother when she, on her wedding day, when she sort of sends them off. And there's a wonderful moment of we're no longer the most important people in each other's lives. You're now with your husband. And you see a real moment of emotion from Hitty, in that my job is done, but I don't want to be forgotten. And I equally don't want to cry on this day, because it's meant to be a happy day. And it's quite relatable, actually. I can imagine a lot of people, even now, sort of having those mixtures of emotion, saying, my best friend is going, because they used to see their daughters as some of their best friends, if their relationship was good. And yet, I want you to go, but I don't want you to go. Especially at that point, she was going to be left alone, because Bess's brothers, she only had brothers, were either all out in their careers or were married themselves. So there was also a sense of the last one leaving as well. So mixed picture. But yeah, he was a lovely young man. I can't remember what he did. He was a middle class, but he didn't mind that she didn't have any money. But they got on very well. They had some children. And one of them, their daughters, actually ended up writing to Hitty. And you see some of the instructions that she gave to Bess, see her giving them to her grandchild, which is lovely. So it's lovely generational pictures. And yes, they did generally live happily ever after. in the end, but we don't really see that from Bath. We see that much more from those local connections in both cases.
Was there much alcohol involved?
Depends which room you're in. So you do tend to get alcohol at these venues, but you don't actually get to hear a lot of it. And there's a question of how strong this is as well. So you might have light beer, for example, which everyone was drinking. You don't really tend to hear a lot, particularly in these letters about wine and things, because that tended to be happening in other rooms elsewhere, card rooms in particular. And I wouldn't have thought it was something that a young woman would equally want to be advertising that she was involved in or surrounded by either. So we know there was drinking in the Bath ballroom, but not particularly surrounding the debutantes. Certainly not that they would write about anyway. We do have another question online if you want me to come to those. When did starting with the minuet fall out of fashion? It started falling out of fashion in the early 19th century in favour of the quadrille. So that tended to come in as the replacement. Maybe because it was too French, it's difficult to say. We were in the middle of a war with France at the time. But they did tend to move away from that at that point. They did have to have specific dress as well for the minuet, which they had to change into and then change back out to. So it could have also been to do with that, I imagine, as well. Yeah, the early 19th century.
Right, well, thank you very much for giving us a better idea of what you'd have to go through if you were looking for a husband and had to come to Bath for this season. So could we all thank Rachel? Thank you.